we ended up calling them Mama Angie and Daddy Mike, and we hoped for that long-term relationship. And I did, for a couple years, I was visiting them. They were together. But ultimately, I would go and visit him in his little music shop in Denver, and he would receive the kids and hold them. And one time I went to visit with Mama Angie's mother, and he wouldn't recognize the children. She was furious. The mother, Mama Angie's mother, Hama, we called her, because that's how our children's older birth sister called her. Grandma tried to say Grandma Hama. Hama was furious with Mike for not recognizing his birth kids, and Mama Angie was furious with him, but he was moving on to another girlfriend, and he just didn't want her to know that he had children. So we haven't heard from him since, really, except once he moved back to Minnesota, and then we got a picture from Mama Angie that they had briefly got back together. They had a stormy relationship. And then I'm thinking of my own spouse who, promised when we were trying to have kids that he was going to be the equal partner, but as soon as they arrived, he couldn't. It was a physiological thing. He just couldn't be around them. It was too hard for him to retreat to his bedroom. He would just, and I realized it was physiological. It was just he was been a single, not single, but he had been a very lonely, alone child, and it was hard for him to be around these crazy. We ended up, a year later, Mama Angie called us and with a second pregnancy with Daddy Mike. So we have 2 children with the same birth parents and a year apart. They're pretty crazy, right? And so that, that was, that absence once again was very difficult, because then I was the one, and Steve was very irritable and difficult around these stresses, and I had to hold that space for the children. And but as they become a teenager, so just a few years ago, I had the younger one. We've been living separately so that I could return to Canada. I had the younger one in Saskatoon, and I actually had both of them, and they were both in grade 9 together. They had been living with different parents, and I couldn't really handle Sky anymore. And Steve came and took Sky back to Colorado, and they've been Steve has been a great parent with teenagers, and very loving, very present for them. And I just wanted to add that I think that part of the reason he's so good is that the kind of care that he got from his father when he was growing up, which was that kind of silent connection. And so I just think of these ironies, right? The ironies and the pain, the absences, but the kind of ironies that some of the things that may seem impossible and challenging are also become those things that become, the support structure. Like right now, Steve and Sky are off on a backpacking trip. They've been doing all kinds of things together in Colorado this last couple years that Sky's been with Steve. And so I don't have all the answers. I'm probably limited from my perspective that I see things through that negative lens. At the same time, these experiences have been real. And I just wonder about, fathering and connecting in the midst of what I think of systems that kind of encourage men not to connect. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry it was a little wandering.
Thank you, John and Kai. So I'll speak for a few minutes about my dad, and then we'll wrap up. In 1951, when Jim Scales finished high school in Salmon Arm, his father asked him at breakfast, "What do you intend to do?" And my dad replied, "I'm going to the lake. I'll hang around for a year until my best friend Doug finishes school." Harold shrugged. At supper that evening, Harold was said to young Jim, "The Bank of Commerce is always looking for young men. You start tomorrow at 9. And that's how my dad started his 23-year career at the bank. As the manager of the Commerce branch in Dawson City, he met Sally Slipetz, a young nurse from Saskatchewan. After a brief courtship centered on curling, beer, and travel, they married in 1961. And on Wednesday, my brother and I are going to take his kids and we're going to Dawson City. We moved several times in the next decade until we settled in Salmon Arm in 1970, and that's where I was raised. In 1972, Dad left the bank and he and Mom bought a coin laundromat, a grueling 2-year experiment in small business. During those years, a steady flow of people came in for financial advice from Dad. And one of Dad's friends pointed out the truth. Jim, you hate running a laundromat, and your financial advice is much needed. So he became a financial advisor for the rest of his working life. My mom started editing a newspaper, and Dad had a business under the same roof. Even after they divorced, they stayed in the same offices and provided advice to each other. My dad strongly believed in service above self. He was a member of Rotary International for 50 years, a member of the Salmon Arm District Chamber of Commerce for 30 years. He co-founded the Shuswap Community Futures and served on its board for 11 years, Shuswap Housing Society board for 22 years, and also volunteered with the Shuswap Coordinating Training Society. His father and grandfather had both been mayor of Salmon Arm, and Dad was an alderman of Salmon Arm for 8 years. 3 qualities stood out for those of us who knew him, although all of us knew a different version of this. Dad was a reader, a careful thinker, a music lover, and a chronicler. He loved reading history, including everything Winston Churchill and Pierre Berton ever wrote. He loved classical music and opera, and used to love attending musical theater. His executors found a thick binder of theater programs from his years of bachelorhood. Dad also had wit and a sense of justice. He loved a good joke, and he could break up the kids with a glance or a grin. At the symphony once, after the first movement of a piece, I was the only one in the audience to clap, because I hadn't heard the announcement that there were 3 parts. My dad sneered at me, shifted away, and said, "Peasant." And I laughed for the rest of the concert. He believed in law and rules, and especially with the rigor and clarity that he saw in the tax code. And he believed in justice. He got angry with us kids a few times for telling jokes that played on racial stereotypes. And it bothered him when rules were applied differentially to politicians and to commoners. My dad was a husband and a father and a dog lover. He was a product of his age, born in 1933. Early in his marriage, he believed that his job was to bring the paychecks home, and Sally's job was to raise the children. As soon as the children were enrolled in school, he insisted that Sally get back to work. Work, as though 3 kids. But they supported each other when Jim got into municipal politics and when he left Salmon Arm for weekends spent cabin building. And he supported Mom in all her business adventures. I had a good dad. He taught us kids how to drive a nail and ride a bike. He was the example of a man who was happy in the kitchen stirring a pot of chili or watching cheese and crackers through the oven window. He loaned money to us when the kids needed it, and he sent us on trips when we were in our teens. He was enthusiastic about his role as grandfather to 5 youngsters. But most of all, Dad loved dogs. As a boy and then as a father, he supported decisions to get family dogs. He would always be gruff about it. Well, who's going to take care of that dog? And then the dog would be his. The last dog, Buffy, was his constant companion after divorce. When I visited him shortly after, I was surprised to find out they divorced. So I went back to Salmon Arm and found that he had taken almost nothing from the house except Buffy and Buffy's leashes and dishes. When Buffy died, Dad did not speak to anyone for a week. When I asked him a year later about this, he said, "I had 3 kids. I only had 1 good dog." Perhaps I'll leave it here and introduce a meditation. This is a meditation